this series, we have been looking at how to make remote work actually work for our firm instead of becoming the nightmare you wish you had never considered. Now, in order to make remote work smooth, we need to have three pillars in place: practicality, legality, and productivity. We started our series by focusing on the practicality pillar, and we're still there. In the last couple of videos, we've looked at your core setup, your minimum software requirements, and in this video, we are going to take a look at the tools and equipment that you need for remote work. In other words, what hardware do you need? And more importantly, what policies do you need in place to cover the ownership and use of this hardware? So, at bare minimum, your remote worker is going to need a computer and screen. It can be a laptop or a desktop, but they're going to need a computer. They're going to need a mouse and keyboard. And if you want them to interact with clients, a phone is recommended. In other words, they have the exact same minimum requirements that your office workers have. If you find your office workers are more productive with a second screen or a headset, then you will probably want your remote worker to have these as well. And they are also going to need some way of connecting to the internet. So going remote does not necessarily save you the cost of equipment. However, if you are hiring this new remote worker cold, you do have the option of making it part of the job requirement that they have their own equipment. This doesn't contravene any labor laws. It is on par with you requiring your office worker to sort out transport to get to the office. So you can save yourself the cost of equipment if you're hiring a worker cold instead of moving someone from your office to the home. But there is going to be a second however. Our next video is going to deal with the subject of cybersecurity in detail. But there is a portion of cybersecurity that is relevant to hardware, so I'm going to mention it now. If you insist that a remote worker uses their own equipment, then you have no control over that equipment. And that means you don't have control over the security of that equipment. For that reason alone, you might want to consider supplying equipment to your remote workers. You can still make the internet connection their problem, but it's probably a good idea for the hardware to be both bought and owned by you. Now, if you are going to supply equipment, then you want to be very sure they understand who owns it and how they are allowed to use it, which leads us to the subject of governance. You need to have policies in place for remote work in general, and a portion of your remote work policy needs to deal with your remote work equipment. As accountants, we know all about governance, and I bet you have helped hundreds, if not thousands, of clients with their policies and procedures over the years. I am also just as willing to bet that you have spent an extremely small amount of time or even no time on your own policies and procedures, because client delivery has a way of taking over everything else in an accounting firm, and then we never get to the work we want to do on our own operations and future. But if you are going to implement remote work in your firm, you need to take the time, set aside an hour or two to create remote working policies. You need to know what you accept and what you do not accept and how you want your remote work to run, and you need your staff to know it and understand that it's policy, not preference. When creating a policy for your equipment, please remember to cover the following: ownership and the expected maintenance of the equipment. So lay out that it belongs to you and that you are responsible for maintenance, but what maintenance means as far as you're concerned. Make sure you cover security, that is both physical security from theft and damage and cyber security. You want to cover who covers the insurance for the equipment, where and how that equipment is stored, because obviously this is going to affect maintenance and condition of the equipment. Cover when and how it gets upgraded, that is both physical upgrades and software upgrades. How the cost of repair or upgrade is handled during the normal lifespan of the equipment. So in other words, according to the maintenance that you agreed upon, how is that maintenance cost handled? And then how is the cost of repair handled if it is damaged by employee negligence or them not doing what they're supposed to do in some way? How is that equipment returned if you cancel their contract or they resign or you end their employment in some way? And what happens if it is not returned or it's not returned in working order? And the last thing you want to deal with is whether or not an exiting employee can purchase that equipment from you and take it with them. You can put a lot more than this into your remote working policy, but please be sure to at least have these points covered. It is also a good idea to have in writing who is responsible for the internet connection, and if you are contributing, state whether you are covering the whole bill or a portion and how you will be covering that cost, likewise with the insurance. So this covers your minimum hardware requirements to make remote work, including what you need in your policies. In the next video, we are going to go deeper into security considerations.